Amazon, Trader Joe's, Starbucks, and SpaceX have been up to something very interesting lately. Yes, they did have SpaceX toy rockets to represent SpaceX, but I saw the socks and I thought, obviously, I gotta go with the socks. So what do these four companies have in common right now? Well, for one thing, they've all had pretty substantial labor disputes recently, and most of these companies have been pushing back against organizing efforts from within their workforce. Now, traditionally, the best way of dealing with employees who are trying to start a union or asking for better working conditions or more pay is just by firing them and reminding the remaining employees that you are God. But because of the National Labor Relations Act, you can't do that. In fact, under the National Labor Relations Act, you're protected against retaliation by an employer. These companies, however, are traditionalists who would probably rather just fire people. So they have all put forward legal arguments that the National Labor Relations Board is unconstitutional. So let's go over what those arguments are. Small history detour. There was a company called the Pullman Palace Car Company. They made sleeper railroad cars, and they had a company town, which the founder of the company, George Pullman, named after himself, Pullman, Illinois. Every house, church, and store was owned by Pullman. The 8-hour workday was banned, there were no saloons, and no unions in Pullman. George Pullman himself lived in a $350,000 mansion. Well, one day after the Panic of 1893, Pullman Company decided it had to cut wages for its employees, but didn't cut the rent it was charging them in the company town. And that was kind of the last straw. So Pullman employees started joining the American Railroad Union that famed socialist Eugene Debs had just founded. When the Pullman Company refused to negotiate, the employees went on strike. And it was a big strike. At one point, 250,000 workers were involved. It became a national crisis. President Grover Cleveland sent in thousands of troops to break the strikes, not to mention the Pullman Company sending in private security forces to break the strikes. In the end, dozens of striking workers were killed, many more were seriously wounded, Eugene Debs and other organizers were thrown in jail. Clearly, it's not sustainable to sic the National Guard on every group of workers who are just looking for better working conditions. Washington, D.C. knew this, so they pushed something pretty radical through Congress. They made Labor Day a national holiday, occurring on the first Monday of September. It would be like addressing the student debt crisis by making a national holiday called Students' Day. But it's actually even worse than that, because part of the motivation for recognizing the September Labor Day was to eclipse May Day, or International Workers' Day, which is on May 1st. The first May Day was one of strikes and calls for an 8-hour workday. It would later also be recognized as a day for commemorating the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago, which was when people were peacefully demonstrating in response to the police killing of picketing workers. A bomb was thrown at the cops by an unknown person. The cops responded by indiscriminately firing into the crowd, killing 4 workers and 7 other cops. A much harder day to turn into a national shopping event. Labor Day, on the other hand, way less serious. From the New York Times, on the first Labor Day parade, about 1/4 of the factories in Westchester County closed yesterday, and the employees, for the most part, came to the city to see the parade. Some of the banks closed, some did not. Post offices were open all day, and in Sing Sing prison, the convicts were kept busily employed for the usual number of hours. Incredibly, Labor Day as a national holiday did not further the rights of workers. What did was decades of egregious, sometimes violent, and sometimes very visible labor struggles and tragedies. The Homestead Strike, the Ludlow Massacre, the West Virginia Coal Wars, the Ford Hunger March, all labor disputes in which people were killed. All of them started with people trying to organize for better working conditions. So the push for workers' rights have been growing for some time, and the NLRA is a real destination in terms of labor legislation because it enshrines your right as a worker to organize. And the National Labor Relations Act created the National Labor Relations Board. You're allowed to go on strike, you're allowed to compare wages, you're allowed to say to your colleague, wait, you make $23 an hour, why do I make $16 an hour for the same job? And your boss isn't allowed to tell you, you can't talk about how much money you make, that's a violation of the act. So even though these giant companies would probably love to be able to just hire Blackwater as professional strike breakers and go back to the 1890s, they can't, at least for now. So these companies have a problem with the NLRA, and there are definitely things worth criticizing about it. For starters, not all workers are protected. Yeah, if you work at Trader Joe's, you're allowed to unionize. But if you work on a farm picking oranges that will get sent to Trader Joe's, you are not covered under the NLRA. Because when the act was being hammered out, people like Senator Ellison Cotton Ed Smith from South Carolina, who is an influential segregationist Southern Democrat, helped exclude agricultural workers because his state produced a lot of cotton, thus his nickname Cotton Ed. Someone who goes by Cotton Ed a racist couldn't be. And he didn't want to grant the ability for farm workers, predominantly black, to organize for better pay or working conditions, which is why farm workers still face that much more exploitation, unsafe conditions, wage theft, retaliation for organizing efforts, and their recourse is limited because of their exclusion from the NLRA. Not to mention the general toothlessness and impoverished state of the NLRB. Employees who defy the board's rulings may not face significant consequences, legal proceedings take forever. The board itself put together a video in which a worker tries to start a union, she is fired in retaliation, and the rest of the video is essentially just an explainer on managing expectations.
We received the decision from the ALJ, and we won.
So when do I go back to work?
Whoa, I wish it were that simple. The board issued a decision upholding the ALJ.
That's great! When do I go back to work?
Now, don't get too excited just yet, Maria. The Court of Appeals has decided to enforce the board's order. We've won.
What happens now? Another couple of years before they take it to the Supreme Court?
Well, I don't know, Maria.
But that being said, these powerful companies are antagonizing the labor board by trying to prove that it's unconstitutional, which means that the board must be doing something right. So here are the arguments. The NLRB penalizes companies without a jury trial. If every case had to go before a jury, cases would take forever, and they already take a long time. That's part of why the NLRB uses administrative law judges. Also, any company can appeal and get it sent higher up. But no, if you appeal the ruling, whether you're the company or the employee, NLRB cases don't go before a jury. But does SpaceX think that they would do well in front of a jury of normal people, or are they just trying to fight the NLRB? It's all in bad faith. The board officials wield executive powers but cannot be dismissed by the president. Basically, the argument is that administrative law judges at the NLRB can't be fired at will by the president because there would need to be good cause. First, judges in general are protected against arbitrary removal from the president. This is to maintain their independence. So administrative law judges are usually considered employees of whatever agency they work for. And if you want to fire one, there has to be good cause. There are like 2,000 administrative law judges in the US, and only 40 of them work for the NLRB. There's no reason to single these out. Also, federal judges have to be impeached, so this argument is bogus. And lastly, since the NLRB can perform quasi-executive, legislative, and judicial functions, it violates the separation of powers. And a key part of what they're getting at here actually turns out to be the 10J injunction. So what does any of that mean? In the National Labor Relations Act, there's a section 10J. The board shall have power to petition any United States district court wherein the unfair labor practice in question is alleged to have occurred for appropriate temporary relief or restraining order. Basically this, it's 2024. If you get fired for trying to organize, by the time the union you're working on finally goes through the whole process, it could be 2025 or 2026. Which means that you likely had to find a new job. You probably moved on, you lost energy, your colleagues who were organizing with you maybe got spooked, maybe they were fired also. So an injunction is basically when a court says, pause, don't change anything while we're going through this process. Don't fire anyone, everything stays exactly how it is until there's an official ruling. So if you get fired at Starbucks, and then through the 10J injunction, get reinstated, it means you're probably going to keep organizing, and so will your colleagues. And it's pretty clear why Starbucks, of all places, would want this to not be a thing anymore. Because of the 31 injunction cases authorized by the board in the last 2 years, 12 of them have been against Starbucks. This is not the first time a corporation has challenged the constitutionality of the NLRA. In 1937, a steel company named Jones and Laughlin fired 10 people for trying to unionize, which would now be illegal under the new NLRA. So the labor board ruled against the steel company, obviously, and told them they had to rehire the employees with back pay. But Jones and Laughlin refused and went further, saying the labor board was in fact unconstitutional. That time, the argument was that labor matters are always local, and Congress lacked the authority to regulate it. Except when you're talking about steel, it's not local because that gets shipped everywhere. It's a matter of interstate commerce at that point. It went to the Supreme Court, which said that a steel strike would have a terrible effect on the economy, and part of the National Labor Relations Act is to protect the economy and reduce industrial strife, as it's called. There have been a bunch of companies trying to challenge the NLRB in this way, and it seems to usually come after said company fires workers for trying to unionize. Because giant companies will always be trying to figure out ways to prevent workers from organizing and to maintain as much control as they possibly can. They will destroy the economy if they have to. They do not care. They would rather let entire sectors of industry pause indefinitely than let their employees organize. But the NLRB was able to stave off cynical ploys by industry for about 90 years now, and the recent set of attacks only symbolize just how formidable the labor movement is at the moment. And that will do it for me. My name is Spencer Snyder. If you found this video interesting, make sure you are subscribed to Breaking Points. You can also check out my YouTube channel where I talk about media and politics and things. Link in the description. Liking and sharing always help. Thank you to Breaking Points. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.